So in the kind of work that I do, we're looking at sort of two main methodological designs. So the first thing is when we're trying to evaluate an intervention, the gold standard is recognised as being the randomised controlled trial. And obviously we're probably all very aware of what this involves, but we've got a population of interest. We then sample from that population and we randomly allocate people either to receive an intervention or a control and compare the average outcome across the two groups. Secondly, if we can't do an experimental study like a randomized controlled trial, we might do a prospective cohort observational study. And this might be because we want to identify whether there are any relationships between variables that naturally occur. So for example, we might be interested in a particular factor as a potential risk factor for the development of disease at a later stage. So this would be a gold standard design we would use to look into this, as well as to describe any natural changes over time in a certain outcome. So again, just to remind you about what this would involve, we'd have a population of interest, we'd sample from that population, and then we would characterise the risk factor or whatever characteristic we were interested in across our group. And then we would then follow people up later to see whether there was a difference between those two groups with the risk factor or no risk factor, comparing the outcomes based on the average response of the two groups. But what I want to think about here is, what does this actually tell us about individuals? So averages, as we know, can be very, very misleading. And this is known to be an ecological fallacy when we apply it in research. So what we're doing really is assuming that the average characteristics of the group apply to individuals that we're studying within those groups. And the average might not actually apply to everybody in the study and may not actually apply to anyone in the study. So for example, here we've got an example based on the number of children on average within families in Melbourne. Obviously we know we can't get 1.8 children. This could equally apply in the studies that we're running as well. So for example, in a randomized controlled trial, individual response to an intervention, whether that's a drug intervention or some other non-pharmacological intervention, it may vary among the people that we're studying, but the average maybe shows that it's an effective intervention. And it might be that some people just don't respond, and it might be that some people are very harmed by the intervention, but we might not pick up on that if we rely on these averages. And it's the same principle again with the prospective cohort study, where we're looking at individual relationships and how they might not match up with the average relationship that we detect from a group-based study. So another approach to looking at sort of more individualized data is N-of-1 methods. So there are a lot of misperceptions about what these methods are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are, and I'm happy to answer questions after. Some people will have come across these methods before. They do involve the repeated measurement of an individual over time. So that collection of measurements will give us a robust conclusion that's specific to that individual. Although we do primarily want to be able to draw those conclusions about individuals, we're also interested in, obviously, population estimates in many cases. So it's not to say that N-of-1 methods can't be used to do that, because we can combine statistically a series of N-of-1 studies to get those estimates. So this is not a sort of qualitative process or a sort of case description, and that's a lot of the time what people think N-of-1 methods might be. This is a very quantitative, systematic, rigorous, scientific process where we can statistically analyze the results to be quite clear about the conclusions in the data. And they're not to replace any other research designs. I don't want anyone to come away thinking that I'm saying we should just do N-of-1 studies. Of course we shouldn't. We do need both types of designs, and these are very complementary to randomized controlled trials as well as the other designs I mentioned. And they can actually be matched together and embedded. An N-of-1 could be embedded within a randomized controlled trial. So they're definitely not sort of in competition. So there are two main categories, just like in group-based research. We've got the experimental designs, which has a couple of sub-designs within it, and we've got observational designs as well. And all these designs are focused on individuals. I'm going to speak a little bit now about observational N-of-1 designs because it's the design that we're using in a study that we've applied in ME-CFS. So this study is called Making It Personal, and it's about understanding symptom fluctuations using the insights that we get at the individual level from N-of-1 observational studies. This is a feasibility study, so we are very much at the early stages in this kind of research. And as it's been mentioned in quite a few talks today, we know that there is a lot of variation between patients with ME-CFS. So that might be the severity or the particular cluster of symptoms that people experience. So we do know that there is variation between individuals. But also what we probably do believe, but isn't necessarily well described in the literature, is there's a lot of variation within individuals in terms of fluctuations in symptoms and how they're experienced by participants. And N-of-1 observational studies might be able to tell us a little bit more about this and give us a bit of a crucial perspective on how these symptoms fluctuate and differ across different people. And we hope that, and this is what we will test, is that it might seem like a useful approach for patients to hear the feedback about their own data, because that might improve management of symptoms and how they can pace activities according to their own data. So the research questions in this study were just to describe how symptoms fluctuate over time at the individual level, so for each person, not aggregating any of the data. Secondly, to use statistical methods to actually look at predictors or potential associations between what might be hypothesized triggers or known triggers, as well as ME symptom severity. The third, and probably the most crucial question we have, is about feasibility and acceptability. So these methods do involve a lot of measurements over time, so we do need to make sure that these are acceptable designs to patients, as well as feasible to conduct as well. So the design, like I say, is a series of N-of-1 observational studies, and this design will be collecting data for at least 6 weeks, but we give the participant the option to extend that data collection up to a maximum of 12 weeks. Obviously, doing this gives us a bit more statistical power, but we need to sort of balance sort of what we ask of the patients as well as what we need for the statistical power, so it's a bit of a negotiation. And the design of each and every single N-of-1 is specifically designed in mind with the person in front of us. So we are tailoring the design to the symptoms, the preferences, the needs of the patient as much as we can. And the participants included in the study, we've got 10 so far, are all over 18 years old, and they all have a medical diagnosis, which is self-reported, of ME-CFS. And participants are recruited in both Melbourne and Brisbane. So the procedures that we're using here, we've got an enrolment meeting where we assess symptoms, triggers, and we speak with the participant about what kind of things they would like to add to the design of our study, so sort of a co-creation of the study. We also use the CCC to screen ME-CFS just to make sure that the people that we're including are the same as each other, and if they're not, they're still included in the study, but we just wouldn't analyse them within the same group. So in terms of the data collection period, it's 6 to 12 weeks. And during that time, they will be prompted 3 times a day to complete questionnaires on an electronic diary, and that will be about sort of real-time assessments of triggers and symptoms. So not asking people to retrospectively look too far back to ask about symptoms, because we know that all humans can be biased by retrospective recall, especially if it's from a long time ago. So it's really about getting that real-time measurement. And at the final meeting, we have analysed the data statistically, and we give the participants the feedback about their data. And we ask them about what they think about this, and this is really the goal of the session, is to hear their feedback and to really take on board what they think and how they think the data matches the hypothesis they might have had before they started the study. And then we'll invite them to do a semi-structured interview, which will assess feasibility and acceptability. So we do have some core measures that we're asking across all participants, but we're very much focused on the personalised measures. So this is what we do with the participant at the first meeting. We come up with what are the personalised symptoms and triggers and any other variables that they would like to add to this design so that we can track it over time. As you can see, the core measures are on the left, and we have within the device, which is on the right, that's what's worn to collect not only the self-report data, but also activity data, but that's objectively collected by the monitor and automatically, so they don't enter anything about that. And then we can look at objective daily temperature as well as a potential variable that might be related in some way, but another objective one. So in terms of the data analysis, obviously the first research question is just looking at how things fluctuate over time, so we can do that visually. But the second part is the more sort of novel part, where we've developed some novel Bayesian time series modelling techniques to look at the data at the individual level. So we have to have these techniques in order to address the fact that the data doesn't actually it would violate the traditional tests, because traditional tests assume that data is independent. So obviously this has come from the same person, we have to address that. So this is the need for the novel statistical modelling. And then acceptability and feasibility, not only through the interview results, but also through looking at compliance with completing the diaries. So the results are not going to be presented today because I do have some for the first few participants, but obviously because we're still running participants, I don't want to sort of present that those results back right now, and very much in the preliminary stages. But I just wanted to highlight some key benefits of using N-of-1 methods in this area and in other areas. So the fact that they're very flexible means that they can be patient-centered designs. And this means that we're able to capture what matters the most to patients. We have the ability to test patient-generated hypotheses. So this isn't just about us coming up with our own hypotheses and sort of putting them onto the participant to test them, but to be able to co-create that process with the participant. We do wonder whether individual feedback would improve the potential for pacing activities. That's something we're looking into in the interviews. And also, if we use these kind of methods for interventions, it might be that we can actually facilitate shared decision-making in terms of any interventions that might help the particular symptoms that people experience, so any that target the symptoms. And this is probably part of a sort of process of knowledge co-creation, where we're really, really keen to involve patients in the design and the interpretation of the data that we're collecting. So opportunities for the future in this area, I think in terms of the research we're doing, as I say, we're at the very early stages, but in the future what we would really like to do, if it is a feasible approach and acceptable, we would really like to look into having real-time feedback interventions that can tell people how things are going, and if there's a prediction of symptoms getting worse in the future. So this is sort of using maybe machine learning underlying this observational design to identify patterns and predictors, learning in real time, and providing that data back maybe through a digital device. We also would really like to explore the possibility of using these N-of-1 experimental designs, which you can see on the right-hand side here, a demonstration of one, where we're testing interventions at the individual level. So in this design here, this is basically applying the principles from the randomized control trial, but to an individual. So within this study design, we're randomly allocating time periods within an individual to different interventions or control conditions, and then comparing outcomes for that individual at the end of the study. And that will give us information about how an individual responds to an intervention. And that might be new interventions, it might be existing interventions, self-management interventions. You know, the world is your oyster. I mean, I would be very happy to discuss anybody's views on this, because that's something that we would really like to do. So thank you very much for listening, and just to acknowledge that Emerge have been brilliant in helping us recruit participants, and also to acknowledge the participants in the study so far who've really done so well to give us so much data, and most of these people have extended their participation, so we're very, very grateful for that. So thank you.
Questions for Suzanne?
Yes.
Daniel?
Thank you for that.
Hi.
It's a wonderful way to move us away from the old patterns. I think you do it with a much more holistic way of managing the My only question to you about that is, how often are people contacted? Like, how do you account for the therapist that placebo response and being seen more often, being listened to more often?
Yes.
Problem, but do you account for that as well?
So there isn't a lot of contact needed actually, because what we do is the design is that the device picks up all the data. It prompts them 3 times a day, so we don't need to prompt people to remember to do that. It does that. And the second thing is that because of the device battery, the original protocol was that we were going to actually have to see people to change over the device to give them a fully charged device. But they all find it very acceptable to just use the charger at home and charge the device themselves, and that reduces the contact needed, which is important as well, because we don't want to sort of make so many contact meetings that it becomes unmanageable for the patient. So, yeah. Any others? Hi.
I saw in one of your slides the word causality, one of my favorite words. And classically, of course, experimental designs that involve perturbations are the way to approach that.
Yep.
But if you're now applying some intervention and measuring 25 variables, those variables might all change, or some subset of them will change. What is the nature of the causal inference that you might make?
So in terms of causal inference, we're actually addressing that within the observational study by using the methods that are developing in the causal statistics area for epidemiology. So this involves how we model and enter our variables into the statistical models that we're using. And that's something that's out of my expertise, but we've got someone who works in that area on the study working with us in that area. In terms of how having lots of variables to look at, I think if you really want to be trying to reduce the number of outcomes that you're interested in, so that you can really demonstrate an effect. And if you are interested in many outcomes, then you would just need to have a lot more phases to be able to confidently say that this pattern has been demonstrated to show that there is an effect of the intervention on these variables. So I think that the main recommendation would be that you would only try and change one at a time. And if you were going to do more, it would become a lot more complex in terms of the design. So does that answer your question?
Any more questions? There's one last
Hi.
one.
This is actually a question from Penelope McDonald McMillan in South Australia, watching via live stream. And she gave me these earlier, so you might have addressed some of this. So the first question is, how do you think this approach could be easily scaled up to include many individual patients with big data analysis to identify patterns?
Yep. So, do you have a second question?
You want the second one?
Yeah.
And the second one is, have you looked at the new DePaul PEM questionnaire, and if so, do you feel it would make any difference to the individual tracking?
So I think in terms of the first question, which now has gone out of my mind, what was the first question again? Sorry.
Sorry, I can't.
What was the first question again?
Well, the first one was, do you think that approach could be scaled up to include many? Yeah.
So I think we really need to depend on digital devices for this. For scaling up something like this, we need to develop ways of collecting data that's remotely managed in digital. So we're also working on that kind of methods as well at the moment. So that would be things like an app that can collect data but can be tailored to the particular condition that we're interested in, but also collect the repeated measurements that we need for an N-of-1 study, as well as being able to, underneath that, have some algorithms that can analyze the data in real time. So, this is not a small task, and it is something that's sort of a goal in the future, but it is something that we're working on at the moment and going towards, yeah. And in terms of the PEM, I think we've seen data that shows that people have such different experiences of PEM. So there might be a different duration, there might be a different time until onset, there's so many factors that I think you do actually need an approach like this to maybe pick up on that. And we're hoping that the method we're using can maybe do that, but obviously, there's disadvantages and advantages to doing that, so we're just kind of working that out at the moment, so yes.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Suzanne, for a wonderful presentation.